in our revolution study group, following our completion of all the various stages of French Revolution, including that in Haiti, people wanted to know what to do, and I suggested the manifesto. And let me say that the version we read in our group was Phil's annotated version. So the relationship of this book, besides the Communist Manifesto, of which we held a 150th celebration of in 1998, but this particular version has a legacy at the MEP, and I don't even know if Phil knew that. But today we get to deepen that legacy, and Phil will speak for some amount of time on this, and everyone is more than welcome to ask questions, make comments. When doing so, in the chat, if you recall, write the word stack so that I'm sure to recognize people in sequence as to their questions or comments. You can go to our site, marxheadproject.org, for other events. Most of you came here to hear Phil, not me, go on about what we have coming up. So at this point, Phil, welcome to the MEP and our consideration of your version of the Communist Manifesto. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Michael. I'm glad to be here, and thanks everybody for showing up on a Saturday afternoon. A few months ago, The Guardian, the British newspaper, published an article which said that the Communist Manifesto is currently having a moment. And the moment is not just because the Canadian musician Grimes posed with the manifesto in Los Angeles in September to troll the paparazzi, according to her explanation, but because, says The Guardian, the manifesto's ideas have a habit of popping up in times of economic and social crisis. So if you've never read the Communist Manifesto before, I would say now is a very good time. And if you have read it before, now is a good time to read it again. It was written now almost 175 years ago. And here's how Marshall Berman describes the impact it has had since then. Whenever there's trouble anywhere in the world, the book becomes an item. When things quiet down, the book drops out of sight. When there's trouble again, the people who forgot remember. When fascist-type regimes seize power, it's always on the short list of books to burn. When people dream of resistance, even if they're not communists, even if they distrust communists, it provides music for their dreams. So the manifesto has an important history, but despite the fact that it was written in the middle of the 19th century, its core message is just as relevant today as when it was first written. The Guardian article that I mentioned a moment ago points out that huge numbers of young people are turning their backs on capitalism. That sentiment has been strong since at least 2008 and the financial crisis, and it's grown stronger as inequality has increased, as the far right has emerged as a serious threat, and as the climate crisis has become an existential emergency. The manifesto is about why a revolution to get rid of capitalism is both necessary and possible, and it's about the basic principles of an alternative to capitalism. And that, by the way, is true even though the word capitalism doesn't appear in the Communist Manifesto itself. Marx hadn't yet coined that term, and in 1848 he calls the society he lived in just bourgeois society. Incidentally, I'll sometimes refer to Marx and Engels, sometimes just to Marx for convenience. The manifesto itself was entirely written by Marx, but he drew on two earlier drafts written by Engels, and the ideas were developed by the two of them together during the 1840s. So crediting them both as authors of the manifesto is justified. There's more about the history of the manifesto in my edition of the book, and if you want to read even more, I'd recommend Michael Lowy's book, The Theory of Revolution and the Young Karl Marx, or the first several chapters of the first volume of Hal Draper's Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution. Or you can watch Raoul Peck's movie, The Young Karl Marx, which is focused entirely on the 1840s and ends with the publication of the manifesto. So the manifesto provides an account of where capitalism came from and how it works, and an argument for the centrality of class for understanding the world and, more importantly, for changing it. And it's that last point that separates what Marx and Engels were writing about and much of what passes for Marxism today, particularly on university campuses. Marx, of course, wrote that the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. But unfortunately, most academic Marxists have given up on this goal. They're happy to interpret the world or to interpret what other people have written about the world, but what they say is accessible only to a tiny audience and has no connection to any kind of genuine political struggle. But Marxism is not an intellectual game that only an educated elite can play. In fact, the basic ideas are very clear, very simple, and I think very relevant for anyone who thinks we need an alternative to capitalism today. So let me start with capitalism itself. When I was an undergraduate, a very long time ago now, the most common criticism of Marxism was that it was outdated. Marx may have described 19th century capitalism accurately, but contemporary capitalism, so the argument went, was different. Economic crises were a thing of the past, living standards were rising for everyone, and capital and labor were partners, not enemies. That was the world of the post-war boom, which lasted from the late 1940s to the mid-1970s. But since then, since that time, the US and world economies have experienced a series of sharp crises. Real wages in the US today are lower than they were in 1973. Inequality has increased dramatically, and we've experienced over 40 years of a one-sided class war from the top. So today, the world looks more and more like the one that Marx and Engels were describing in 1848, a point that even many opponents of Marxism acknowledge. According to a New York Times article that was written before the financial crisis of 2008, more than ever, Americans do not trust business or the people who run it. A majority of the public believes that executives are bent on destroying the environment, cooking the books, and lining their own pockets. Pretty accurate, if you ask me. In 1998, on the manifesto's 150th anniversary, numerous mainstream commentators enthused about how well Marx had described capitalism. An article in the New Yorker said that Marx wrote riveting passages about globalization, inequality, political corruption, monopolization, technical progress, the decline of high culture, and the enervating nature of modern existence, issues that economists are now confronting anew, sometimes without realizing that they are walking in Marx's footsteps. It's because Marx and Engels lived at a time when modern capitalism was young that they were able to analyze the system in a way that captured its essential features and its core dynamic. So here, for example, is their dazzling description of the incessant change that capitalism brings in its wake. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real condition of life and his relations with his kind. So the manifesto charts the way in which the development of capitalism has shattered narrow horizons and produced technological marvels. But it also describes capitalism as a system that is increasingly running out of control. Capitalism concentrates wealth and power in the hands of a small minority. It creates huge pools of poverty. It turns life into a daily grind that prevents most people from fulfilling their potential, and it experiences frequent and enormously wasteful economic crises. I think we probably all know the figures for growing inequality and concentration of wealth in the United States. In the 1970s, the wealthiest 1% owned about 20% of the nation's total household wealth. Now they own over 35%. The disparities have become even greater over the past 18 months. US billionaires have grown $2.1 trillion richer during the pandemic. Their collective wealth increased by 70%, from just short of $3 trillion at the start of the COVID crisis in March 2020 to over $5 trillion in October of this year. Globally, the figures are even more astonishing. A few hundred people around the world own more than the combined income of over half the planet's population. The corporate class is squeezing more and more surplus value than ever from those who work for them. And even those who regard themselves as middle class are often just a single paycheck away from poverty. Capitalism encourages greed, competition, and aggression. It degrades human relations so that they are frequently based, as the manifesto notes, on little more than naked self-interest and callous cash payment. Capitalism's ceaseless drive to expand not only destabilizes social relations, sooner or later it also undermines the conditions for economic growth itself. Marx and Engels argue that capitalism is a system in which highly destructive economic crises are unavoidable and which has thus become fundamentally irrational. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld whom he has called up by his spells. In a world threatened by pollution, global warming, and the destruction of ecosystems as the result of uncontrolled capitalist growth, this image has got special resonance, I think. Today, the search for profits threatens to destroy everything in its path, including the natural environment. Capitalist society has raised production to the point where everybody could be provided with a decent life, enough to eat, a comfortable place to live, health care, educational and recreational opportunities, and much more. But the conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to comprise the wealth created by them. Each successive crisis can only be overcome, they write, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises. Private ownership and the anarchy of marketplace competition are no longer compatible with large-scale economic production integrated at the social and global levels. The only solution to these devastating problems is the abolition of capitalism itself and its replacement by a system in which the majority of the population democratically controls society's wealth. So the manifesto is above all a revolutionary call to action, an explanation not only of what is wrong with society, but how it can be transformed to create an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Central to this strategy for change is its claim that in the modern working class, the proletariat, capitalism has produced its own gravediggers. Marx and Engels argue that capitalism has created a group of people with both the capacity and the interest to fight for the overthrow of the existing system and the emancipation of all humanity. The power of the working class is based on the fact that capitalism socializes the labor process, bringing workers together in large urban centers and in bigger and bigger units of production. At the same time, the pressures of economic life tend to push workers together to fight back against their exploitation. And because of their key economic position, workers have the collective power to bring production to a halt by going on strike. Of course, most workers do not begin with the goal of making a revolution, but as they are forced to engage in the class struggle to protect their own interests, the collisions between individual workmen, I'm quoting again, and the individual bourgeois take more and more the character of collisions between two classes. The working class is not perpetually on the verge of revolution. For long periods of time, many workers may be satisfied with their lot under capitalism, or at least willing to put up with it. But Marx and Engels understood that this state of affairs couldn't last forever. The chaotic, turbulent, unplanned development of capitalist economies eventually throws whole societies into turmoil and turns even the most modest of working class demands into a challenge to the whole system. This process is not a smooth one. The ruling class attempts to weaken the working class by exacerbating national, racial, and other differences. But such divisions can be fought and overcome as capitalism continues to intensify the class struggle. And because of their strategic economic position, workers, whether blue-collar or white-collar, industrial or service, have the power to become masters of the productive forces of society by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. Now, Marx and Engels may have had an over-optimistic conception of how quickly these processes would work themselves out. But since the mid-19th century, capitalism has repeatedly shown that it cannot avoid periodic crises, and that these crises may bring the barbarism of modern warfare in their wake. At the same time, the working class has grown ever larger, increasing its potential power to shut down the economy and to threaten the very existence of the ruling class. Even in the United States today, where unionization rates have been declining for years as a result of a sustained employers' offensive, a clear majority of the workforce would like to join a union. Time and again over the last 150 years, workers in countries around the world have shown their capacity for mass action and, not infrequently, revolutionary struggle. Even in the United States, there is a rich tradition of working class and socialist struggle. But the socialist tradition in the US has been marked by deep discontinuities, with periods of mass radicalization like the 1930s and the 1960s being followed by decades in which socialist ideas have barely existed. Although none of these periods of radicalization fulfilled its potential, the defeats and disappearance of the movements thrown up by them were by no means predestined. There is nothing inherent in American society that doomed these movements to failure. Will there be new upsurges in struggle in the future? According to a major study issued last month, we are currently in a historic period of protest. The authors, and I'm going to quote from a Washington Post article about the study. The study is available online, by the way. You can download it. They looked at demonstrations between 2006 and 2020 and found that the number of protest movements around the world had more than tripled in less than 15 years. Every region saw an increase, the study found, with some of the largest protest movements ever recorded, including the farmers' protests that began in 2020 in India and which have just had most of their main demands met. The 2019 protests against President Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and ongoing Black Lives Matter protests in the US since 2013. Looking closely at more than 900 protest movements or episodes across 101 countries and territories, the authors came to the conclusion that we are living through a period of history like the years around 1848, when the manifesto was published, 1917, or 1968, when large numbers of people rebelled against the way things were, demanding change. According to one of the study's authors, too many leaders in government and business are not listening. The vast majority of protests around the world advance reasonable demands already agreed upon by most governments. People protest for good jobs, a clean planet for future generations, and a meaningful say in the decisions that affect their quality of life. And it goes on, other than issues with democracy and political representation, the report identifies rising inequality as another broad theme of protests around the world, contributing to nearly 53% of the protests studied. Individual issues raised by protesters included corruption, labor conditions, and reform of public services, followed real democracy as the most widely cited. There was also a significant increase in demands for racial or ethnic justice, such as with the Black Lives Matter protests. But the report also notes that there are a smaller number of protests with right-wing politics, focused on denying the rights of others and scapegoating racial or national minorities. An important reminder that in times of crisis, the right can grow as well as the left. At the center of the manifesto's vision is the idea of working class self-emancipation. As Engels puts it in one of the later prefaces to the manifesto, our notion from the very beginning was that the emancipation of the working class must be the act of the working class itself. Working class self-activity and self-organization is thus the key both to successful revolution and to the new form of society such a revolution would bring about. Now, the communist argument against socialism today is that the collapse of the Soviet bloc over 30 years ago shows that no alternative to capitalism is possible. But I would argue that the societies that collapsed in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe had little in common with Marx and Engels' conception of socialism. Just as in the West, workers in these countries were exploited by a privileged ruling class, and while internal markets in these countries had largely been abolished, the pressures of military and economic competition on a world scale imposed on them the same dynamic of accumulation and growth familiar in the capitalist West. So the collapse of these regimes is in no way an argument against the possibility of genuine socialism. But unlike the early utopian socialists, who they discuss in part 3 of the manifesto, Marx and Engels do not offer a detailed blueprint for the future. They are not interested, they say, in drawing up the best possible plan of the best possible state of society, or painting fantastic pictures of future society. Such dreams are unconnected with, quote, the material conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. And it is primarily with analyzing these material conditions that Marx and Engels concern themselves. But the analysis of these conditions does allow them to formulate in general terms the principles on which a socialist society would be based. The first and vital step, they say, is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class, to win the battle of democracy. Democratic working class control of society in both the economic and political realms is the defining feature of the manifesto's conception of socialism. Without real democracy, there is no socialism. But how is democratic power to be exercised? In their preface to the German edition of 1872, they point to the example of the Paris Commune of 1871, where the proletariat for the first time held political power for 2 whole months as a concrete historical example of what they had in mind. And this year, of course, is the 100th anniversary of the Commune. And it's worth pointing out in this context that this was the event, the Paris Commune, that made Marx notorious. It earned him the label of the Red Terror Doctor because of his outspoken support of the communards. And it led to the manifesto becoming one of the most widely read books in history. In 1848, the manifesto was published in the same week that revolution broke out in France and soon spread across the rest of Europe. In that respect, the manifesto was enormously prescient, but it was also enormously ignored in the 1840s. In the heat of struggle, it sold very few copies. There was eventually an English translation by the socialist feminist Helen McFarlane. That's the one that begins, "A frightful hobgoblin stalks throughout Europe." But for the next 20 years, it was completely ignored. And it was only after the Paris Commune that the manifesto became a left-wing bestseller. It was reissued and at that point started to be translated into many, many different languages. That Guardian article I began with points out that it's just been translated into Somali. In the 1872 preface, Marx and Engels write, "One thing especially was proved by the Commune, viz. That the working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes." As they put it in the manifesto itself, the bourgeoisie has conquered for itself in the modern representative state exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. And that means that the working class cannot simply take over the existing state, but must completely refashion it. During its brief existence, the Paris Commune instituted a number of important measures along these lines. The standing army was abolished and replaced by workers' defense committees. Police, magistrates, and judges were appointed by the community and could be quickly recalled. All elected officials were also revocable at short notice, and most were not professional politicians, but workers or working class leaders who were paid only workers' wages. The executive and legislative functions of government were combined, so the Commune was not just a talk shop. Instead, it provided a first concrete example of the way in which workers' democracy could be achieved. In the context of workers' democracy, the new society could advance towards its ultimate goals, the elimination of private ownership of the economy and production for the market, and the final abolition of all class divisions. But Marx and Engels are clear that such dramatic economic and social changes, unlike the seizure of political power, can only come about by degrees. But through such measures as nationalization of land, banks, and large-scale industry, combined with heavy taxation of the wealthy, the new society could gradually eliminate production based on market competition and replace it with workers' control of production and democratic planning designed to meet people's needs and provide them with the opportunity to develop as free individuals. At the end point of this process, when class divisions have finally disappeared, the public power, in other words, the state, will lose its political character, ceasing to be a means for one class to impose its will on another, and becoming instead simply a forum for democratically resolving disputed issues. There's one final aspect of the manifesto's vision that I think is very important. Capitalism, as we have seen, is an international system. For this reason, it's impossible for a single region to break free from capitalist relations of production on its own, at least for any significant period of time. The only way in which a workers' revolution can ultimately survive is if it spreads to other countries, since the resources needed to abolish scarcity are only available on an international level. But precisely because the world economy is more and more characterized by universal interdependence of nations and improved means of communication that place workers of different locations in contact with one another, the prospects for such a revolution are arguably better today than at any earlier time. So the manifesto's final call for international solidarity is not just an abstract moral slogan, it's an essential precondition for the transformation of society. Capitalist crisis is inevitable, but socialist revolution is not. Capitalism may yet bring about the common ruin of the contending classes, which Marx and Engels mention at the beginning of the manifesto. Only the active intervention of organized revolutionaries, what they call the most advanced and resolute section of the working class movement, with a clear understanding of the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement can bring about a different outcome. But of course, there is much work to be done. The left in the US and most of the rest of the world is still weak. We need to rebuild what my friend Alan Sears has called infrastructures of resistance and dissent, organizations that don't disappear when movements go into a lull. Movements go up and come down, and the pattern, particularly in the US, is that there is incredible activity for a period of time, but when the movement declines, everything disappears. And a few years or months later, it seems like you're back at square one again. And of course, with the climate crisis looming, time is not exactly on our side. But if you accept the manifesto's analysis, this is the task which is by which we are confronted. So I will stop there and throw it open, because I hope there'll be plenty of comments, questions, and opportunity for people to talk about what's on their minds.
Thank you, Phil. So some of you came in after starting. What we like to do is have people who want to ask questions or make comments write the word stack in chat, but if you don't know to do that, just raise your hand in the rectangle, but you need to show yourself for me to see you. And we're ready to take questions. Jose, you are asking a question in your comment. What is the role of automation in affecting the power of the working class? That is from Jose.
Do you want me to come right back, Michael, or wait till we've got a few more?
Well, while people get warmed up to this, we could start with this one, and then we'll take 2 or 3 at a time once we get into the groove here.
Sure, yeah. This has been a big issue, right? Recently, people talk about the role of automation, and a lot of things are being automated. In the production process, in the circulation process of goods and services, etc. However, that does not mean that the working class disappears. And from the point of view of capitalists, it can't disappear, because it's the work of labor that produces value in the production process. If everything could be done by machines, without any human intervention whatsoever, imagine that, right? There's nothing you have to do. Everything just appears. It doesn't have value for anybody, because you can automatically get whatever it is that you like. You know, it's like Star Trek, where you have replicators. You don't have to do anything to produce something. You just say what you want, and it appears, right? You can't run a capitalist economy on that basis, because everybody can get, as long as they have access to the replicators, they can get whatever they want. More realistically, while automation pushes some people out of jobs, it creates new jobs for other people. There have to be people to run the machines, to make them, to repair them, and that can create an enormous amount of power, because it means that the people who are playing those roles, if they withdraw their labor, they shut down everything, right? You can concentrate production through a few nodes, but the people who are playing a key role at those nodes then have immense power. You can see this in terms of the growth of the so-called logistics industry, which is highly automated. This is the way in which goods are transported and distributed through the economy. There are massive logistics centers in most of the major urban areas of the United States and other parts of the world, and the people who work there have an enormous potential power by withdrawing their labor and bringing the whole whole system down to a halt. There's a kind of negative example of that going on at the moment. We have enormous supply chain issues in the distribution of goods right now. That's not primarily because people have withdrawn their labor, although there are some important strikes going on around the world related to the distribution of goods. It's primarily because a system which operates in this way with long supply chains moving through, concentrated distribution centers is very vulnerable to one piece of it gets shut down and the whole thing gets shut down. So I think the same is true about the automation process. It puts enormous power into the hands of the people who are who play the role of keeping the automation going. You can't exclude labor from the economy in any massive way. There always will be large numbers of workers playing important roles. Automation has always been used. The use of automated methods, it goes back to the 19th century. It's often used to try and weaken the power of powerful sectors of the labor movement, and they will try and use it that way today as well. But it doesn't mean that the power or the potential power that workers have to shut things down and use that power to transform society has disappeared.
Thank you, Phil. Jose asked another question, but we like to have anyone who has not asked the question to be able to ask their questions first. So we have a number of new people. David has asked, do you see universal basic income as something that will accustom people to socialism, or is this a delaying tactic by capital? Then Sam Friedman, right after David, asked, in the last 20 years, we have seen numerous political revolutions, many with mass working class participation, oust governments and even regimes, but not go on to the social revolution. How do we overcome these limits? And then Sam also wanted to know, while we have Sam here, could you cite the report on the social movements from 2018 to 2013? There's another question, but these have a lot of substance, so take it away, Phil.
Yeah, they do, and I'd be happy if other people want to jump in and discuss them as well. Universal basic income is an idea that people would receive a certain amount of money automatically, just as a result of citizenship or residency in a particular state or area. And I don't think there is a simple answer to what the effects of doing that would be. David asks, is it will it accustom people to socialism, or is it a delaying tactic by capital? I think you can make both arguments depending on particular circumstances. It could be. I think this is true of all reforms under capitalism, and this would be a reform, right? It would be a way of trying to provide people with some basic needs without changing the ultimate nature of the system itself. And all reforms have got this dual potential. They can tamp things down and reinforce the existing system, or they can whet people's appetite for greater change and demanding more. And which that they do often depends on how they are won. So is universal basic income something which is handed down as a ploy from the top, or is it the result of a movement that organizes around that issue and fights for it, and creates something which can then go on to fight for more? So I think everything depends on the context. So I don't want to say one way or the other definitively. At the moment, I think most of the proposals out there are coming from the top, and they're not coming from a movement which is fighting for that particular demand. So some of the proposals which have been kicked around may be intended to have that tamping down effect. Whether they do or not, well, it's hard to predict that in advance, and particularly if they do connect with something, with a movement from below, they could have a very different consequence. Now, Sam asks the $64,000 question here, or $64 billion question in the modern world, to which I wish I knew the answer. One thing I do know the answer to is the name of that study. Let me actually just look it up for you. It's called World Protests. It's published by Springer, and it's available free. I mean, it's a fairly extensive study, but you can download it as a PDF or an ebook from the Springer website. There's multiple authors. So the first one on the list is Isabel Ortiz, Ortiz, but I won't read the names of all the authors. But if you do a Google search for that, World Protests Springer, you'll find the citation and the site where you can download the study. There have been numerous major, you might call them revolutionary rehearsals. There's a new book out from Haymarket Books called Revolutionary Rehearsals in the Neoliberal Era, and it's a discussion of some of these major movements from the late 1980s up until very recently. It doesn't go as far as the latest wave in Algeria and Sudan and so on. Sudan is, as people may know, is a very intense area of struggle right now. But it includes, for instance, the Arab Spring and Egypt, which is a major example, I think, of one of these movements that managed to overthrow the old regime. Mubarak was forced to resign, which threw up some new forms of organizing, which involved millions of people getting together on the streets, which had begun to have a significant labor component to it as well, but it was still fairly rudimentary, but which was eventually crushed by a military coup. There's a similar dynamic going on in Sudan right now, a mass uprising which overthrew a dictator, new forms of organizing, and then for a while a kind of unstable alliance between civilian elements and the military. And then last month, or maybe it was the month before, there was a military coup. Now, since then, there have been more mass protests in the streets. Neighborhood committees have been set up. A lot of repression by the Sudanese military. But then they made an agreement with the civilian elements to go back to a kind of power sharing model in an attempt to shut down what's been going on in the streets. The people on the streets don't want a power sharing model. They want the military out. They want democratic elections. They want popular control. Where that is going is anybody's guess at the moment. The situation is still very unstable, but it's not a clear win in any respect for the popular movement, and it may yet become a defeat. I hope not, but we will see. So yeah, the book that I mentioned goes through a number of these examples, and it points out some of the things which have changed since there were also important revolutionary movements in the 60s, 70s, into the early 1980s, and it's called Revolutionary Rehearsals in the Neoliberal Era because it's pointing out some of the things which have changed under neoliberalism, which is the name which is given to the more intense form of capitalist organization since the early 1980s, late 1970s, early 1980s. Less state regulation, big attack on unions, cutting taxes for the wealthy, all those things which have gone on, and it is kind of there's been a kind of reatomization of the working class in many places around the world. The old organizations which they had relied on no longer exist. The whole structure of employment has changed over this period of time. Whole industries have disappeared, and new forms of employment have replaced them. Now, this again is not something new. I mean, I think this is a feature of capitalism. It goes through processes in which its structure changes fairly dramatically from one period to another. In Marx's day, the largest section of the working class was domestic servants, I believe. By the end of the 19th century, that was not true, and the industrial economy had started to emerge. Now, people talk about a post-industrial period, but through it all, there remains a working class with the potential for organizing and fighting for its interests. But it has to be it doesn't happen automatically. It has to be a process of fight back in which people are consciously trying to build organization, figure out new strategies, and so on. So it is a contested field, in other words. So I don't know the answer to Sam's question and what we need for to have any of these movements to have been successful, except in the most general terms: better organization, clearer politics, and so on. But what these movements do show is that the turbulent nature of the global capitalist system is not going away. It's going to continue to throw up these as long as the system survives. Who knows where climate change is leading us, and what stresses there are going to be on the entire system as a result of that. But for as long as the system survives, it's going to continue throwing up these challenges, and it'll be up to our side to figure out what are the most important steps needed and building the kinds of organization needed that can push them further than just challenges to the system or movements which overthrow one political regime but then replace it with another while the underlying economic factors are fundamentally unchanged. So that's the big question, and if we had an answer to that, or if there was an easy answer to that, I think we would already have transcended capitalism, but we're still fighting against it.
Thanks, Phil. Berta and Steve Knight have questions. Berta is, what are your thoughts on reproduction, sustaining life beyond, with, and as part of the production process? And then Steve wants to know how the manifesto was publicized during the mid-19th century, especially the up through the mid-1850s. So there you go, Phil.
Okay, well, two very different questions. Thanks, Berta, for the question about reproduction, and this is this has actually been an area that has got a lot of attention lately. Social reproduction theory has emerged as a very sort of exciting area of developing Marxist theory. And I'm pleased to say that most of the people who are working in that area are doing it very concretely. This is not just one more sort of abstruse theoretical corner of the academic universe, but it's trying to understand the processes by which capitalism continues to operate as a system from day to day and from year to year and from one period to another. And that while Marx's focus is very much on the process of production, there is also the flip side is the process of reproduction in which labor power has to be reproduced. And Marx does talk about this, and he knows it's an issue, but it's not his main focus. But it's come to be a very crucial area for understanding, how capitalism works, but also it's becoming a crucial area for political organizing as well, I think, because it's so the reproduction of labor involves how it is that a new generation of workers is created and produced, and how labor from day to day is replenished so it can continue to do its play its role in the economy. And a lot of this takes place in a totally privatized area. I mean, some of it is education, for instance. At least education till you're 18 is largely run by the state, right? Parents are not expected to provide the education for their children. They send them to schools for that to happen. But most other things, or many other things, take place in a privatized way. Feeding your family, for instance. In the U.S., healthcare is like that largely, right? Not the case in some other countries where it's almost every other developed country where healthcare is provided by or subsidized by the state. It involves all of these processes together, and some of these have become areas of contestation and struggle. So we have a massive healthcare sector in the U.S., right, which plays a role both as a profit-generating area of the economy, but also as a key component in reproductive processes for the economy. And healthcare workers have become important players in the labor movement and in fighting for important demands. Same is true in education. I mentioned that's largely provided by the state until you're 18, but it's an area of contestation, and it intersects with every other area of people's lives. So when teachers' unions go on strike these days, and it's been in the US, that's been a big area of activity, they are most successful when they link up the sort of narrow issues associated with their workplaces to broader community-wide issues of social reproduction. And one other thing I'll mention is the whole fight around childcare, which is a major issue for many working families. It's so expensive and it keeps people out of the labor market, etc. So demanding that there be affordable childcare is certainly a big issue. That is another instance in which the reproduction process under capitalism can lead people to organize and to engage in a different form of the class struggle. So yeah, I think all of these things are terrifically important today, and are likely to be more so because all of these things are becoming increasingly expensive: healthcare, childcare, education. So they are very likely to be areas of struggle, not necessarily directly connected to the workplace, but potentially they may be connected to workers, who are in those areas, as well as the people who consume what is produced from those areas. So that, yeah, very, very important part of the way in which the system operates and in which people may come to challenge it. Steve's question about publicizing the manifesto, I don't think it got a lot of publicity when it first came out. I mean, it was published in German in London, which wasn't you're not going to have the biggest audience for that to begin with. When Helen Macfarlane's translation came out, I think in 1851 or 1852, it was published in one of the workers' newspapers that were a legacy of the Chartist movement. By the 1850s, the Chartist movement, which was the first mass working class movement in England, Engels writes a lot about it in The Condition of the Working Class in England. But by the 1850s, it was very much in decline, but it still had a number of publications and organizations and so on. So it got a little boost from that. But as I say, mostly for the next 20 years, from the early 1850s to the early 1870s, it was forgotten. It wasn't republished during that time. So I guess if you could find a copy of Macfarlane's translation in an obscure newspaper, or the German edition that was published in 1848, you could read it. But yeah, the standard English translation, which is available in most editions. In my edition, I updated some parts of that translation, but that didn't come out until the 1880s. So it was a while. It took a while for for the manifesto to get its legs. But in the 1870s, it did start to get translated into other languages, and that accelerated. By that time as well, there were beginning to be political organizations which could use it for education and so on. So it made a big difference that by the 1870s, the Social Democratic Party existed in Germany. And in 1881, I think, was the founding of the Second International. And that played a big role in making the manifesto available. And we know by the early 20th century it was extremely popular. That and Engels' book, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, were the two main books that people, in the workers' movement would read to understand the nature of capitalism and the history of the socialist movement. So anyway, that's my long-winded answer to Steve's question.
So Susan Comfort, I'm sorry, Susan. I asked if she wanted to ask it, but there it is. This is going to be a one question round, Phil, because there's a lot here. How can the climate movement be brought together with labor organizing? It's frustrating to see green capitalism governance continue to define terms of change, mitigation, and adaptation that perpetuate exploitation of labor and commodification of nature, especially in the global south. So that's Susan's, and I think that's a lot to take on at once. Then Alejandro has asked a question very related to the one I will ask. So after that, Alejandro and I will do the next round. Go ahead, Phil.
Okay, sure. I mean, yeah, this is a big issue. Yes, there is a climate movement. Although in the U.S. right now, again, I think it's weak. That's partly because we've had over 18 months of COVID, which has made organizing and getting out into the streets and so on difficult. There are some pieces of it which have some important, which have been doing some important stuff, and particularly the opposition to pipelines and anti-pipeline organizing. I'm in Madison, Wisconsin, and one of the things we've been organizing around for the past few years now is Enbridge's Line 3, which runs from Canada through Minnesota into northern Wisconsin and then to Lake Michigan. And it is one of the conduits. They were rebuilding it. It existed before, but they were making it so that they could transport ever larger quantities of tar sands oil from Canada, which is one of the worst, most polluting oil. So there was concerted opposition around that, which continues, even though Line 3, they completed the construction and it's in operation now. There's still opposition going on. There was important opposition to that, just as there had been to other pipelines like KXL and the Dakota pipelines, etc. So that's one area where there's some, important activism has happened. But by and large, the labor movement has been missing in action from this, or worse, has taken has lined up on the wrong side of it. This is largely because the big construction unions, put jobs for their members as their top priority, and don't look at this in the wider context of a sustainable economy that could actually provide jobs for much larger numbers of people over a longer period of time. But it's something which has to be overcome. Now, at the COP26 talks, total failure in Glasgow last month, there were big demonstrations in the streets outside of the talks. The biggest was on the Saturday, November 6th. Well over 100,000 people there, and it was led by unions. It was led by a number of Scottish unions, and interestingly, they had already been involved in strike action. Independent, it wasn't, the demands had nothing to do with directly to do with climate change or climate issues, but they saw a connection between what they were doing and with climate movement. So that connection was able to be built in Scotland, and in a number of other places there have been important there's been important involvement by labor in around environmental and climate issues. That has to be much stronger. I mean, the lesson from COP26 is that the governments of this world, which represent capitalist interests, are not turning. They're doing the bare minimum. I mean, they make promises, and the promises aren't sufficient to deal with the crisis, but they don't even keep the promises. The gap between what they do and what they say is huge, and the gap between what they say and what needs to be done is huge. And it is quite clear after 30 years of fighting around this, and the crisis is getting worse and worse, that no matter how much they say it's a existential crisis, we have to act, etc., they won't do it because they act in the interests of the major capitalist corporations, fossil fuel, auto industry, the construction companies, etc. And all of those will lose out enormously if we are able to institute the kinds of changes that we need, which is basically we have to shut down the use of fossil fuels and transition to sustainable energy sources. And of course, capitalists will try and make money out of those as well, but they're going to lose a huge amount of money from any kind of transition. The only way that that can be forced through is if there is a movement which is powerful enough to make the costs so high for them that they have to make the change. And that has to be based around the working class and labor action. It can't just be, Extinction Rebellion going into the streets and shutting things down for a few hours. Although I admire that when they do that, that has to connect up with a force which is capable of confronting the central powers of the capitalist economy. And I think that force has to be, is only the working class. But there's a lot of work to be done in terms of building a movement which brings those things together. There are some unions in the US which have got very good positions on climate. They tend to be those which are involved with what I was talking about before, social reproduction. So teachers unions and healthcare workers unions, the nurses union, they've all got good positions on climate and would back radical proposals. They do back radical proposals, but it's not enough. We've got to have the rest of the labor movement on board, and more broadly, the working class, most of which is unorganized in the US. So, yes, crucial issue.
Thanks, Phil. And Alejandro is going to ask his question, and then I'll pose mine after Alejandro, and they're related to part 2 called Proletarians and Communists, part 2 of the manifesto. Go ahead, Alejandro.
Thank you. My question kind of revolves around the early parts of the second part of the manifesto. Marx and Engels kind of talk about saying that the worker really doesn't have a country, and that it needs to kind of have a unified action in kind of countering the ruling class in a sense to free itself from these kind of struggles that it faces. And my question kind of revolves around just like in our modern day society, can you see like the common person, or as they would kind of say, the working person, looking past like the national and kind of social divides that kind of are presented at us in the modern day and unite in a common struggle as like they try to promote? And in general, do you see this kind of being, as they talk about, like a first condition to, as you talk about in the end of your section of the manifesto, still relevant, this kind of workers' democracy, or this new form of democracy, unlike the democracy we see in capitalist society today?
And my point is related to the very beginning of part 2, and thanks, Alejandro, that's really good. And I will read the very short paragraphs at the beginning, and it's chapter 2, Proletarians and Communists, and it's posed as follows. In what relation do the communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? The communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The next paragraph has more, but you don't need to have me read it. I will just say that informally I have surveyed people around the Marxist School, Brecht Forum, and our current MEP on how they take this, and almost everyone in a party, be it Maoist, Stalinist, Trotskyist, says that Marx wouldn't say that today. He would pick their party. And those that are non-sectarian and not in parties say, yeah, that's means that we are at a premature point for having a communist party. So I'm just wondering where your take is on that, Phil, and if you've ever done similar investigation of people on, and did Marx mean that we do not form parties at this point prior to the class being more aware of its conditions and ready to act of by and for itself? So that's it.
Thanks, Michael. Let me start with Alejandro's question about nations, nationalism, etc. I think there are a number of places in the manifesto where Marx gets a bit carried away in terms of the projecting processes, as it were, right? Or how quickly they're going to operate, or whether they're going to move to completion in a certain way. I think that's probably true about. I mean, he looks at the nature of the world economy, right? It's more integrated. It is a global economy, and if that was true to a certain extent in the middle of the 19th century, how much truer it is today, right? And since it's gone up and down a little bit how integrated the world economy is. There are periods in which it is moving more in that direction, then it retreats into more protectionist and more sort of nationalistic approach. We're kind of in one of those phases right now, where there was a huge burst of integration under neoliberalism in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. Now we're seeing a bit of a drawback from that, right, into more into. I mean, they can't draw back from it completely, or even very significantly, but you can move a little bit in the other direction, and there you see that in terms of tariffs and sanctions, the trade battles which are going on, particularly between China and the US, but also other, the US and Europe and etc. So you get a movement in the other direction as well. In terms of workers, it's a big question about how far and what is needed in terms of internationalism. I think we see glimpses of it though quite often when people are inspired by the struggles which are going on elsewhere, and they see direct connections. So I was in Madison 10 years ago, in 2011, when the Wisconsin uprising took place, and the state capitol was occupied for several weeks. Democrats left the state to prevent the Republicans from having a quorum in the Senate so that they could pass anti-labor legislation. There were mass demonstrations almost every day with tens of thousands of people. I think the biggest of the protests was close to 150,000 people outside the state capitol in Madison, which is pretty big. If this is a city of only about 250,000 people, so people came from all over the state and from other states, etc. But the reason I mentioned this was because at this heightened level of, now eventually these protests were defeated, but at this heightened level of organizing, it came right on the heels of the Egyptian revolution, and people immediately drew parallels. And it wasn't just parallels, some connections were set up. People in Tahrir Square heard about what was happening in Wisconsin, and they sent pictures of people holding signs, in solidarity. So there was very much, people were thinking about this as, hey, there are connections between our struggles from very relatively distant part of the world, but we can see that we are on the same side, fighting around this. So that's the kind of movement that I think that you tend to get when there are big, successful, powerful, revolutionary movements. People connect with them and they identify with them, and they see themselves more as part of an international struggle. But then the other side of it is nationalism hasn't gone away, and it's a big tool that is used by rulers to divide and to demobilize people, have them identify with with the most narrow form of of national a national entity, right? So obviously it's a big deal with the right in the US today, and as we know, it can be effective. People can be led to see this as their main interest. So I don't think the process is nearly as automatic as Marx and Engels sort of present it in the manifesto. But I also think that there's a real potential for international solidarity, and that's what we have to try and build on. Michael's question is a bit different, this one, about how communists organize. I was just taking a quick look in my edition to see what I wrote about this. So I do have a few comments, which if you've seen the book, I comment on most of the paragraphs, but not all of them, but most of them. And what I wrote here as commentary on, they do not set up any special principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement, and they're not a special party. The first thing I pointed out is that party, when at the time they were writing, had a more general sense. I mean, it's not so much a political organization, but a tendency or a set of interests, or people with a set of interests. So they don't set themselves up as rivals to existing working class organizations. And I say such as the Chartists in Britain. They would have seen themselves very much in alliance with the Chartist movement. But they would have seen themselves also as representing a particular strand of thought within that movement. Yes, they want others to be influenced by their ideas, and they see them as the way forward, but they see it as taking place within this broader, so that it's not like you don't go off and set off the real Chartists or the revolutionary Chartists or whatever. You operate within this broader movement or set of organizations as its revolutionary wing. So that's the way I think that they thought of it. They do have their own set of ideas, and you can be in a broader movement and have your own organization of some kind, as long as you don't see it as antagonistic to that broader movement. You're not the alternative. It's us or them. You are part of this broader struggle. So that's what I think that they meant. Whether I don't know what members of the various socialist, revolutionary, communist organizations think of what they're up to today. I mean, clearly, there's far too much division and sectarianism on the left historically. But also there are important differences, right? And the question is, can you argue out those differences in a way that is fruitful and constructive, and doesn't just lead to further fragmentation and antagonism and so on? That's a hard one, because the history is that the divisions are seen as so significant that you end up not working with other people. So organizations are fine, and we need them. We need organizations. But in terms of, if you have a set of views, which I do, I've got a whole set of views about what the important tasks are and how to analyze the world, and big issues like what's the relationship of the left to the Democratic Party, right? Well, big issue in the U.S. which has divided the left ever since I've been involved, and for a long time before that. So those divisions exist, and the question is, how can you work with others in a broader movement without just papering over the divisions, but having constructive arguments around them? So that's the goal, the ideal. That's what we need to be able to do. In practice, it can be very hard to do that. And you find yourself splintering off into, antagonistic grouplets, which ultimately doesn't help at all, because even if you've got the right view, just being gloriously isolated or separated from the rest of the movement, or the movement being fragmented into these different pieces, isn't what we need. We need a movement where we can have debates around ideas, and hard debates as well, but also work together to take things forward. It's more complicated than it was in Marx and Engels' day, of course, right? But it was complicated in their day too, because the debates which they had in the First International, which was set up in the 1860s, particularly with the anarchists, were extremely fractious, and eventually led to the First International, falling apart. So there's plenty to learn from the history here, and how we managed to take constructive lessons from that. Well, that's part of, whether or not we're going to be successful today.
Good point. Phil, there is, Jennifer has a question. I don't want to have this centered on my question, but there is that section in the manifesto where they break down all the political parties, and it's interesting that in the mid-19th century, the bourgeois parties had in their title or in their conception some type of orientation around the word socialism. So you would talk about this bourgeois socialist party, that other socialist party, etc. And we don't have that now. I mean, the right in the U.S. uses socialism as a dirty word to typify anyone who thinks that Social Security should continue beyond 2022, kind of thing. But let's get over to Jennifer, who says, you mentioned earlier that many people are moving away from capitalism because we're much more aware of the inequalities we face, especially after the pandemic. Many people began to reflect on their emotional, physical state and prioritizing needs over jobs. How do you see this playing out moving forward? And can our strongly rooted capitalist practices change enough to see a significant impact?
Yeah, great question, Jennifer. I mean, I think the pandemic has, really shaken things up in terms of the way that people think of employment and so on. You can see this in terms of what they have called the Great Resignation over the past few months, in which unprecedented numbers of people are quitting their jobs because they are not satisfied with with their working conditions. You see it in the continuing shortage in the hospitality industry, which has traditionally been terrible working conditions, low pay, horrible hours, all of that stuff. There's been this kind of shift certainly in psychology of that what the people aren't prepared to do this, and they either look for something better or they are coming out of the workforce for extended periods of time. where this goes, well, I mean, there are fights around, there's an immediate fight around better working conditions. The thing is, mostly what we're seeing is decisions being made on an individual basis. It's not that we are, there's no organizing going on around this, or very little. It's not that, people are organizing together, or all going to leave our job on Thursday. They're just doing it because they're sick of the current situation. But there is great opportunity for organizing around some of these issues. It connects up with also the issue of social reproduction. Will there be changes, significant changes? I mean, in some areas there have been. I'm lucky enough to, I work in education, and I work from home almost all the time now. I hardly ever have to physically go to campus. I can do that in the kind of work that I do. Of course, there's a lot of work which you can't do remotely. You have to go, to the supermarket, or to the factory, or whatever, or to the restaurant. And around all of those issues, whether we need to go in or not, what kind of hours people have to work, what kind of conditions they're working under, there's an opportunity for organizing. I have friends who are involved in the restaurant organizing project, which is taking on some of these issues. The hardest thing for them, they've told me, is that people don't last very long. They work for a few weeks sometimes, and then they quit. And so even if they're interested in doing labor organizing, they're no longer in a position to do it. But yeah, I think all of those things are true. I think that in some areas there will be concessions made. In other areas there won't, as is always the case with capitalism, and the concessions will never be enough anyway. But these are things which need to be taken on. One of the issues that Marx began writing about in the 1840s was the alienation of capitalist society, and I think we see plenty of that right now, and it's been accentuated by the fact that we're still in the middle of a public health crisis, and it's left a lot of people more isolated. So all of these questions need to be taken on by if we had a much bigger and more vibrant socialist movement in the US, it would be taking on all of these things.
Very good, Phil. We'll get back to Jose's second question, which is on Cedric Robinson's take on, Jose, it was so long ago. Could you come on screen and ask your question about Cedric Robinson so I don't waste time? Are you still here, Jose? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering about your take on Cedric Robinson, Black Marxism, and its relevance for today's struggle.
It's been a while since I read Cedric Robinson, Jose. My general take around the issues of oppression and racism is the most important of those in the U.S., both historically and as a model of how other forms of oppression have worked. Is that they have to be a central part of the any left movement, and the reason for that is quite simple. It's the most important tool that the ruling class uses to keep people divided. And you can't get around, you can't deal with an issue like that by ignoring it or pretending that it's not there, which is unfortunately the position of some people on the left. They want to sideline or downplay issues about oppression and focus on what they see as the real class issues, which are universal, right? So don't talk about racism, talk about Medicare for all. Don't focus on a sectional demand. Look for issues which are of importance to everybody, regardless of their, particular identity within society. And I think that's the wrong way of looking at it, because first of all, they are all class demands. Fighting racism is a class demand, as well as fighting for better wages or fighting for universal health care or whatever it may be. And secondly, unless you take on those issues, the working class remains divided. I mean, it's so clear in the U.S. today that racial divides are being used by the right and by it's not just the Republicans, it's also large parts of the Democratic Party that do this as well. But it's used as a way to keep workers separated and keep them from organizing together for their own demands. So the most successful examples of organizing the entire class have been certainly in the U.S. have been instances in which issues of racial oppression and other forms of oppression have been taken up. So in the 1930s, when the biggest left organization was the Communist Party, they put a premium on fighting against racism, and it played enormous dividends when they were organizing in auto and the other major industries, because they had won the trust of different racial groups, particularly African Americans, but also they organized within within auto. The demand was for the lowest paid to have the biggest pay increases, and the lowest paid were, of course, in the segregated industry, were all people of color, mainly African Americans, also I'm sure some Latinos, etc. So I think that's a great example, and the best of the unions which organized in the 1930s had this very, they had strong communist influence, and they took on these wider issues. So that's my view. You got to take them on. You take them on from a class, wider class perspective. But if you can do that, then you can beat back these divisive attacks which come from the right.
Thank you.
So, Phil, I know this is a huge task, and I'm not expecting you to perform this task, but what is something you would put in a communist manifesto if Marx and Engels were writing this in 2021?
Well, I think I'd put a lot more about some of the issues we've just been talking about in there. I mean, there's little tangential references in the original manifesto, but they have become much bigger issues. So issues of, social reproduction, oppression, the climate crisis, right? I think these all fit into the bigger picture that Marx and Engels are sketching out. It doesn't mean a fundamental, change in the underlying understanding of how capitalism works and the role of the working class, but I think those are issues which need to be not just mentioned in passing or in, reading the tea leaves, but should be front and central in our organizing today. So those are some of the things I would emphasize.
And you did mention that you're doing a new edition, which will be somewhat changed afterward or forward afterward. I forget what you said.
Yeah, I wrote an afterword for this edition, which is titled, if I look at it, "Is the Manifesto Still Relevant?" And as I mentioned when we were starting, I wrote that in 2005, so it's 16 years, and that was before the financial crisis. That was before. I do mention environmental issues, but the climate crisis has become so much more intense since then, and it was before the resurgence of the far right as well, which I think is a serious problem in the U.S. and globally, right? And this is what you see in periods of intense crisis of capitalism. We're kind of used to the kind of centrist politics of the of mainstream parties, but in a period of crisis, the old style of doing politics doesn't work anymore. I mean, people get disillusioned with it, and there are also new issues for the system to deal with in terms of changes to the way that production works, etc. So new international tensions as well, something we haven't really talked about, but that's part of the picture too. So you get the emergence of these far right formations, sometimes as new independent groupings, or in the US, we see it in a different way. That we see the rapid metamorphosis of the Republican Party from a sort of traditional right of center political grouping to one which is far more extreme. Not yet fascist, I would say, because I think that has a particular definition. Certainly fascistic elements, though, and similar developments elsewhere. India, Brazil, almost every country in Europe has a significant far right today, which didn't exist 20 years ago. So that is part of their response to what is going on, and so I'll have to say something about that in a new edition. So that's basically what I'm going to do is rewrite that section. And as I mentioned, also I've updated the further reading. So,
well, you mentioned early on how the rural workers in India and the farmers were able to beat one of these proto or fully fascist governments like the Modi government. And they did this despite all odds. And to me, that is an incredibly significant moment in our human history in some ways. And we don't get that much coverage in the American press. I did like that you mentioned that. And in some ways, it's counter to the experience of urban with rural workers in our collective past all over the world. Even though I'm sure there are moments. The Wobblies organized in agriculture quite a bit, and there was the farm worker movement here, etc. But I feel that might be part of what you address in this updated version.
Yeah, no, it is a fantastic victory. They haven't won all of the demands, but they won the biggest ones, and nobody expected that to play out in that way. I think we all get a boost when a struggle like this wins somewhere, and I think there are some lessons. India is a very different society from the United States, but the persistence of the Indian farmers, the kinds of organizing which they did, the mutual aid which they created, the connections between the urban and the rural, there's a lot there that we can learn from, as well as just the inspiration. So, yeah, important victory.
So I don't see. There are a million more questions people would have, but what they're not looking at your book, Phil. I really appreciate that you put this book together, and the importance of it, and are getting a revised version. So anyone who wants to get Phil's book, it's available. You can go to all those Bezos-like places, but Haymarket, which is a left publisher, we should be consciously supporting our left publishers and buying from them when we can. And Haymarket always has this book at a reasonable price. So those of you who don't have it, go out and get it. I need to locate mine on the bookcase, but so I had to refer to Marxist.org for my reading, and couldn't see what Phil had put next to this. But I really appreciate your visit today, Phil, and appreciate all of you who came to find out what Phil had to say about the manifesto. And it's a book that you can read and learn something from repeatedly from now till whenever your long lives will come to some type of transition. So one other event coming up that I neglected to mention, but when Phil talked about the movement amongst African Americans, that was the organization and the teams through the sit-downs, was very significant. We have Mark J. and Phil Conklin, who are coming in early January to read from their new People's History of Detroit. And unlike many of the People's Histories, this one is more explicitly Marxist and does do a lot of class analysis from a Marxist perspective. The book is exciting to read. It's not put out by Haymarket, it's a Duke Press book, but it's relatively inexpensive and it's available in ebook. That will be January 8th, right after the holidays. Phil, thank you very much, and we'll have you again when your new edition comes out.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.